I grew up speaking Japanese and English together, but of course, once I come to the States, there's less opportunity using Japanese, and then feeling this inner panic, like, oh, I'm gonna forget. I'm not gonna be able to speak as well as I'd like to, especially my reading is writing is at a level of a fifth grader in Japanese. So that I think holding on to these ways of being able to communicate in a different language helps me to tie back to heritage, like cultural belonging and family, and then being in an environment where I can't communicate certain things. Because I think every language is very specific to its own. There's different nuances and ideas to express like a situation or emotion. And I think it's sometimes scary to feel that I'm not where I'd want to be with that. And I think customs, I'm still not quite sure how I would explain that into words, but maybe it's like gestures, or even in the painting, the idea of like stillness and kind of this calmness and a way to be able to internally retreat, I think ties back to, I grew up in the country in Japan too, so kind of this silence and contemplation. I visited the US multiple times throughout my childhood, but I think completely moving and leaving your family, your home, and your friends, just everything behind is very scary, especially when I was young. And then now moving from Hawaii to California was this another similar event of cultural shock coming out to California, because it's so different in the environment and like local culture too. But it's constantly finding ways to reconnect and try to settle down in a specific place. And I think it's like a continuous journey, figuring out how do I fit into these new locations. And I do see myself consistently probably moving, since it's been a trend every like 10, 15 years, I seem to be moving to a different location. So I grew up in Japan, and then I moved to Hawaii, and I spent, from like sixth grade all the way up to graduating college, and then staying there a little bit after too. So those two places really play a role, like how, like the environment around me, the culture around me, people, and I guess even like natural elements to that. I think it's very specific to each location. And then now moving out to California, I moved out here just for grad school, and I think that was a big change. So being able to go back to these places that that I found comfort and that I found familiarity with, I think starts to play these like symbols and imagery into my work. And I recently went back to Japan last year for family, and I spent 4 months there, which I haven't done that since I moved out of the country. And being there, I was from winter all the way to spring. I'm from Hyogo, but my family lives in Tokyo now. So it actually snowed for once, which was really amazing to see. And then I was fortunate to be there when the cherry blossoms were in bloom too. And those only last for about 2 weeks. I think that locality and specific nature of like the time passing and the time spent with family was really important to me. And I started to think about that more into my work and how I could start to reference that in very like subtle ways. So blossom. So that's kind of this period between winter going into spring. So it's right before the cherry blossom. So I think, and then making these images in a much more simplified form kind of cancels out the extra noise for my work. And another imagery that I've been using too was the motif of an orchid. And of course, the idea of orchid, it's so common, but then they become very specific to different cultures. So if we go to grocery store out here, there's a very common orchid, but of course there's orchids that grow on the mountain and all that. So I guess finding reference point to these graphic images that are used in Japan as kind of this anchoring point and language in my work. And then I try to tie that into like the abstract imagery, which works kind of as this atmospheric space. So a place to settle down and to kind of contemplate. It's this idea of comfort, familiarity. And I guess I am like tied to the good times that I had as a child in Japan. And always, of course, you know, being around family and sometimes, or even language too, watching certain videos in Japanese versus English. I think small things like that, not necessarily tied down to a location, since I do feel that I'm always on the move. So it's these gestures or things that I talk about, how I talk about it, things that I watch, even the foods that I eat, I think is really part of this idea of belonging to. It's hard to define an actual home because I think I've let go the idea of a secure home or a very stable home a while ago when I moved out of Japan, because we don't have that home anymore. We don't have any of our um, belongings. We had to move to the US on this kind of sudden uh, moment. So knowing that it's not permanent as well, that home isn't a permanent object, but it's more, I guess, the connections that I make with uh, people or certain moments, I think is more of this idea of a home. I mean, I would like to have a place that's the traditional idea of a home at some point too, of course. You know, it's similar ideas or it's somebody of a different experience. I think we're all like artists are trying to get to this inner point of, I guess, what's important to them. And that's interesting and important and starts to build a community and, you know, my artist friends and people who I can talk about art, but then we can also talk about life too. So I think that all starts to mingle together. Even though it's a very individualistic aspect, I think what comes out of the time I spend in the studio, the works that I make, I think acts is like is a stand-in for me where it can communicate with other works in a very different quiet way. It's actually been hard to find. I'm still kind of figuring out my community within California, especially grad school was all online. And I think that was a bit harder to connect with a lot of people, especially I think the digital screen all the time was a bit awkward. But I've slowly started to build my community of artist friends and have other artists who are from Hawaii too, that we can kind of talk about art and culture to, like we sit some kind of share like similar backgrounds and went to the same college too. I don't necessarily think I'd look Asian because I'm half white. My mom's German Irish and my dad's Japanese. I think from the outside, I'm like really pale too, and I don't think I look more Asian, but it's really upsetting and it's, unacceptable of like what's happening. It's kind of crazy, especially seeing all of this happen, living in California. And I know growing up in Hawaii, I mean, I don't think, of course, there's still racial tensions, but I don't think it's at to the point how it's happening in California, especially the past years. And it's not only just with like Asian American people too, it's a lot of other um, people of color. So it's scary to see all of that happening around me. And for me, my family, they live in Japan. My dad's side, they all live in Japan. So to them, they see all the news too, right? And they just think America's such a crazy place. But at the same time, Japan is mainly Japanese people. So it's, I think, a different kind of mixture of how, I guess, not to say that there's less diversity. Of course, there's other people from different countries too, but it's not at the extent of the United States. So I think it's very complicated when people have different ideologies and beliefs, but then I think it comes from a place of people not understanding and being ignorant and maybe not educated in certain aspects or not having compassion towards people with different the way they look or different ideas. It's definitely there to remind people and to remind and to remember certain incidents that has happened in history with whether it's like a visual language, visual imagery, or it could be kind of done within a community. So it could be performative or very socially driven too. And I think it's always there for people to look back to and remind us we're doing the same thing. Like, why are we like doing this to each other? I mean, history is repeating itself, and art is always recording certain moments that happen throughout life, like big moments too. And whether it may not be so direct, I think it's always tied into events that happen around them. So even thinking about like abstract expressionism coming out after World War II and that tying into a lot of European artists who immigrated from Europe to escape the war and how that influenced American artists and all of that. So it always ties back into a bigger, I think, political background more than a lot of us realize sometimes. So it's not just a single piece of work. It connects to other artists, it connects to other events. So, and I also think about my works in Japanese, like the title of the work in Japanese, and then I also think about it in English. So what would it be called in Japanese and what would it be called in English? I guess the importance of not a singular sense of identity, but duality as well. And I mean, to know that there's a million other, like so many other people who share, I'm sure share similar experiences too of growing up in a different country and then moving to another country or even moving different states too. I think that's a really big change too. And I am interested on a formal level too of my work and how my work fits within the language of abstraction and non-representational imagery too. But then like what more can I say with my experience that's different from other people too, and putting the personal into these I think, ambiguous situations that I've created in my works. It's really what they can take out of at the same time, as well as people really being able to find a personal connection or really a moment to pause and kind of slow down within the work as well. I do find myself very fortunate to be able to have grown up in Japan and grown up in Hawaii, and to have been able to go to UCSB where I met Tui. And I think that is kind of the wholeness of me, of these different locations. And I've noticed, instead of kind of categorizing myself as this one, like Japanese only or American only, it's like basically everything. The idea of like Japanese American still feels a bit different for me in my work. It's kind of hard to describe because I still feel so connected to Japan, and um, with family still living there, and like the need to go back there. But then also in Hawaii, I think that was a really good place to grow up too, because there's a lot of, like, most everybody is mixed race out there, and a lot of culture, like local culture, is just a mixture of like Hawaiian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Portuguese, like just everything is so mixed in together that I think that's like a single entity. And I find myself taking a lot from that experience. And then moving out to Santa Barbara was just kind of a very strange experience too. And the people living out there, of course, is a whole different kind of energy and atmosphere. I always find it very difficult to exactly replicate who I am, in a sense, because it's this like a reduction of a picture. I think where it's shown, what context it's being shown, who's the audience, also changes how the work is being presented at the same time. And I know, like, the work and my name attached to it, I think people will have an association that I'm Japanese as well. And that could build into a conversation that, even though I'm not there, I think people could perhaps make a kind of connection to that as well. I'm hoping a lot of times with the title to play a little bit a role into kind of decoding the work, at least onto a personal level. Growing up, there's so much things that like you realize and look back and think how stupid I was, or just ridiculous. My works have changed quite a bit, starting with my undergraduate studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, all the way, or even before that, community college at Kapiolani Community College, and even as a kid, just doodling and drawing. So it's gone through a lot, and I think it's always reflecting the moment that I'm in, and the openness that I have with myself and being honest with my work. And more in the beginning, I would do a lot of figurative works, so with a human figure, and then I was really interested in this surreal landscape. And that really evolved to a point I got kind of stuck and sick of it, and then completely went into abstraction and removed all of um, kind of recognizable images and subjects. And then moving out of Hawaii was like another turning point. Again, it's reminding me of the time when I moved from Japan to the United States, and then realizing the discomfort that I had, and this challenge of resettling myself and being very uncomfortable and feeling lonely and kind of this sense of longing for home pushed me to look inward and try to pull out these imagery that was familiar to me. And I started to look at the ginkgo blossoms or ginkgo trees and those leaves. Like I would see it in Santa Barbara, which I don't think they have that in Hawaii. I've never really seen it. But then I remember seeing that in Japan too. So again, I'm in a new place where they actually have seasons. Of course, it's not as intense as other places, but then now I'm in a place that has these seasons from cold to hot. And I think that was this metaphor for me to look around me and try to put that into my work to mark like the distance that I've physically and emotionally have come from the different places that I've lived. Now being more honest within my work and to be able to share with other people these experiences in very minor and subtle ways is, I think, how my work is kind of grown into right now.